Picture this. You wake up tomorrow morning. Your bank account shows the same balance it did yesterday. You're not broke. The numbers are still there. But when you try to withdraw cash, the ATM screen goes blank. You drive to the bank. It's closed. Just a hastily printed sign, temporarily unavailable. You're not poor, you're just powerless. Because your money didn't disappear, access to it did. And in that moment, you'd discover what millions discovered in 1929. Wealth isn't what you have in an account. It's what you can actually do when the system stops working. When people think about the Great Depression, they think about Black Tuesday, the crash, fortunes evaporating overnight. But the crash wasn't the catastrophe. What came after was. Between 1929 and 1933, over 9,000 banks closed forever and 25% unemployment. Factories are going silent across entire states. The social contract itself began to dissolve. And people discovered something terrifying. When the system fails, survival doesn't depend on what you own. It depends on what you can do. Why does this matter now? Because we're living in a system far more complex and fragile than in 1929. We can't grow food, can't repair our tools, can't navigate without GPS, can't transact without the internet. The average person today is more capable within the system than ever before. But outside the system, most of us would be helpless within 72 hours. This is a story about what happens when everything stops working, and what we can learn from the people who survived it. The system didn't just fail, it vanished. And with it, everything people thought they knew about security. 9,000 banks closed between 1929 and 1933. Not temporarily, permanently. The money people had spent decades accumulating vanished. Not because they spent it, simply because the institutions holding it ceased to exist. Unemployment hit 25%, 1 in every 4 Americans without income. In some cities, it exceeded 40%. Entire communities where nearly half the working population had nothing. Industrial production fell by 50%. Steel mills, textile plants, and automobile assembly lines are silent, as if someone had simply turned off the machine that powered American life. And these failures were interconnected. When banks closed, businesses couldn't get capital. When businesses failed, workers lost jobs. When workers lost income, they couldn't buy goods. A death spiral that fed itself. But the numbers only tell you what broke. They don't tell you what it felt like when money stopped meaning anything. Money is collective fiction. It works as long as everyone agrees to keep pretending. The moment that the agreement cracks, the illusion collapses. People still had dollars, but those dollars couldn't buy what they needed. Stores couldn't restock. Suppliers had no inventory. Manufacturers had closed. Banks wouldn't extend credit. So you'd walk into a store with cash and find empty shelves. Or the shopkeeper wouldn't sell for money because he couldn't use that money to restock. He'd rather trade directly, your labor for his goods. Money became irrelevant because it represented access to a system that no longer functioned. And people discovered the terrifying truth. Wealth isn't what you have, it's what you can access. When the system controlling access breaks down, accumulated wealth means nothing. So what did people do? They remembered something the system had made them forget. When currency didn't work, people traded what they had for what they needed. Barter economies emerged organically across America. In Nebraska, farmers formed swap societies, corn for shoe repairs, firewood for milk. In Ohio, unemployed mechanics fixed farm equipment for food and shelter. In Minnesota, communities established barter stores, where goods were exchanged based on labor hours, not currency. By 1932, over 400 such informal economies operated across the United States. 400 mini-systems, proving that exchange doesn't require currency, it requires value. And what became brutally clear? The people who thrived weren't the ones who'd had the most money. They were the ones who could still produce value without it. When the system vanished, it revealed which skills actually mattered, and the answer surprised everyone. In a functioning economy, replacement is easy. Radio breaks? Buy a new one. Do shoes wear out? Buy another pair. But when the economy collapses, replacement becomes impossible. The only option is repair. Blacksmiths who'd been disappearing suddenly found demand again, repairing farm equipment, fashioning replacement parts, creating tools that factories no longer produced. Tailors reopened shops in basements, transforming worn garments into usable clothing. Mechanics became the backbone of rural economies, keeping ancient equipment functioning when no new vehicles were being purchased. By 1933, the repair trade had grown by 45%, while luxury manufacturing fell by 60%. Repair skills, which the modern economy had devalued, became survival skills. But you can repair a tool, you can't repair hunger. That required a different skill entirely. Food became the national obsession, and knowing how to grow it became more valuable than almost any white-collar skill. Victory gardens appeared everywhere. By 1934, over 20% of urban families were growing at least some of their own food. These were people learning agricultural skills out of necessity because the alternative was hunger. In Fayetteville, Arkansas, entire neighborhoods created community farms. A single acre could provide vegetables for dozens of families. People who'd spent their lives in offices found themselves learning to plant, cultivate, and harvest. It was humbling, exhausting, and essential. Because money could evaporate, jobs could disappear, but hunger remained constant. The person who could produce calories from soil had something no collapse could take away. But the most powerful survival skills were the ones that worked completely independently, with no system required. When hospitals closed, doctors didn't stop practicing. They just practiced differently. House calls, accepting payment in eggs, vegetables, and labor. When schools closed, teachers kept teaching, gathering students in homes and barns. Knowledge was transferred from those who had it to those who needed it. In West Virginia, unemployed miners built Arthurdale, a self-sufficient community with their own schools, clinics, and cooperative stores, functioning independently of the broader economy for 7 years. These skills, medicine, education, building, proved fundamentally independent of institutions. The institution made them organized, but the core value required nothing but knowledge and cooperation. Eventually, the system came back. But what came back wasn't what had failed. It was something new. Whether it was better is still debatable. In March 1933, Roosevelt shut down every bank in America. Federal examiners audited each institution. Only solvent banks could reopen. Simultaneously, he established the FDIC, and the government explicitly guaranteed individual deposits. Your money was no longer just the bank's promise. It was the government's promise. This changed everything psychologically. Bank runs stopped, deposits returned, confidence rebuilt. But here's what's crucial. This didn't make the system safe. It made people feel safe. Those are very different things. The underlying vulnerabilities weren't eliminated. What changed was that the government promised to intervene when things went wrong. The system wasn't made stronger. People's faith in it was artificially supported. Safety was replaced by confidence management. The other solution was putting millions back to work. And the method fundamentally changed American society. Roosevelt's public works programs, the CCC, WPA, employed millions to rebuild infrastructure. Roads, bridges, dams, schools. The physical legacy remains today. These were skill-based programs hiring carpenters, masons, and engineers. The economy was rebuilt by people who could actually make things, validating Depression-era survival strategies. But there was a crucial difference. During the collapse, these skills made people independent. In recovery, they made people dependent on government employment, projects, and wages. Before the Depression, American culture valued independence. Self-sufficiency was a virtue. The New Deal changed that. Government support became not just acceptable, but expected. Social Security, unemployment insurance, and agricultural subsidies, these prevented enormous suffering. But they also created structural dependence. People stopped preparing for system failure because they believed it couldn't fail, or that the government would prevent it from affecting them. The skills that had saved people, food production, repair, community cooperation, began to fade. Why grow food when supermarkets are reliable? Why learn repair when replacement was affordable? The capacity for independent survival atrophied. People became more specialized, more dependent, more vulnerable, but less aware because systems seemed stable. The rebuilt system worked. For decades, it worked beautifully. So well that people forgot it was a system at all. After the Depression, America entered unprecedented economic growth. 30 years of expansion, rising wages, and increasing standards of living. A generation grew up that had never experienced systemic failure. With each passing year, Depression lessons seemed less relevant. Why maintain skills you'll never need? Why prepare for a collapse that won't happen? Agricultural knowledge became unnecessary. Food came from supermarkets. Repair skills became obsolete. Goods were cheap enough to replace. Community interdependence seemed quaint. Specialization became success. Find one thing, become an expert, and integrate into the economic machine. Trade all other skills for currency. It worked brilliantly, as long as the system kept functioning. And because it kept functioning, it seemed like it always would. This wasn't stupidity. It was a rational adaptation. When systems work reliably for decades, treating them as reliable is logical. The problem: reliability isn't the same as invulnerability. And periodically, the cracks showed. Brief moments when the illusion shattered, just long enough to reveal what lay beneath. The 1970s energy crisis, gas lines, inflation, the stable system suddenly vulnerable to external shocks. The 1987 crash, the market lost 22% in one day. Automated systems that should have made markets efficient instead amplified panic. The 2008 financial crisis. The global system came within hours of meltdown. Banks, too big to fail, were failing. For a moment, total collapse seemed possible again. Each time, government intervention prevented full collapse, bailouts, stimulus, and monetary policy. And each time, the lesson people learned: the system might wobble, but won't fall. Someone will always catch it. But that's not what history showed. History showed collapse is always possible. We'd just gotten better at postponing it. Each intervention increased complexity and interdependence, creating new vulnerabilities. We weren't becoming safer, we were becoming more dependent on interventions working. Which brings us to now. A system more complex, more interconnected, more fragile than ever, and a population less prepared than at any point in history. Today's system operates on layers of incomprehensible abstraction: digital currency, algorithmic trading, AI-managed supply chains, cloud-based everything. Financial instruments are so complex that even traders don't understand them. It's extraordinary, and extraordinarily vulnerable. Every layer of complexity is a potential failure point. Every point connects to every other in ways not fully mapped or understood. And the average person has less practical survival capacity than at any point in human history. We debate economic policy endlessly. But we're not asking the fundamental question the Depression forced people to confront. If the system stopped tomorrow, bank accounts inaccessible, stores closed, supply chains broken, payment systems down, what could you actually do? Not theoretically, right now, with current skills and resources. Could you feed yourself without grocery stores? Stay warm without utilities? Treat an injury without hospitals? Repair essential equipment? Navigate without GPS? Communicate without the internet? For most people, honestly, no. Or maybe a few days before critical gaps emerged. This isn't a moral failing. It's a rational consequence of living in a functional system. You don't maintain skills you don't need, but your survival is entirely dependent on systems you don't control, don't understand, and can't maintain. You've traded capability for convenience. That trade makes sense until the system fails. And individual capability is only part of the equation. The other part is even more concerning. During the Depression, communities were primary survival mechanisms. Neighbors helped neighbors. Social capital became wealth. Those networks existed because communities were already connected. People knew neighbors, belonged to organizations, and had dense social networks built over decades. Today, those networks have dissolved. You might not know your neighbors' names. You have no established patterns of mutual aid. Your networks are digital, spread across cities, mediated by platforms, dependent on functioning infrastructure. If the system failed, digital networks would disappear, and physical, local networks that could replace them don't exist anymore. High dependence on complex systems, low capability for independent survival, minimal community resilience, every vulnerability amplified. The Great Depression teaches us one thing: systems fail. Always. Eventually. When they do, the people who survive aren't the wealthiest or best educated. They're the people who can still function outside the system. That was true in 1929. It's been true in every crisis since. There's no reason it won't be true in the next one. The Depression forced people to rediscover that wealth isn't what you own within a system. It's what you can do without one. Today, we don't have to develop those capabilities. The system works. So we specialize, going deeper into narrow expertise, becoming more valuable within the system and more helpless outside it. This is rational. This is comfortable. This is probably fine, for now. But probably fine for now is not a long-term survival strategy. The Depression survivors didn't predict the crash. They just had skills that worked when it came. They could grow food, repair tools, build shelter, and cooperate with neighbors. Not because they were preparing for collapse. Those were just normal capabilities. We've traded those for specialization and convenience. It's been a good trade, for now. But systems change. And when they do, the question won't be how much money you have in accounts you can't access. It'll be, what can you actually do? Because if history teaches anything, it's this: the system will eventually fail. Maybe not today, maybe not in your lifetime, but eventually. And when it does, capability will matter more than wealth. Skills will matter more than savings. What you can do will matter more than what you own. So here's the only question that really matters. When the system fails again, and history says it will, what will you actually be able to do?